A Marine? Here? Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a naval facility for precision ordnance. We deal with billion-dollar systems, not iron sights and Kentucky windage, the crowd of polished Navy officers and civilian contractors, all adorned in crisp, clean uniforms and expensive tactical apparel, let out a ripple of condescending laughter. It wasn't loud or overtly cruel, but worse, it was the kind of soft, dismissive amusement reserved for a child who had wandered into a discussion of advanced physics. The man who had spoken, Commander Davies, stood with his hands on his hips, a perfect caricature of mid-level authority. His uniform was starched to the point of being a fire hazard. His jaw was tight with self-importance, and his eyes, scanning the woman before him, were filled with a profound, unshakable certainty in his own superiority. He gestured with a sweeping arm at the vast, sun-baked expanse of the White Sands Advanced Weapons Range. Gleaming white radar domes dotted the distant hills like giant mushrooms. The air hummed with the latent power of high-frequency transmitters and the silent, watchful eyes of long-range telemetry cameras. This was a cathedral of data, a place where ballistics were calculated by supercomputers and trajectories were plotted to the micron. It was, in his mind, no place for what he saw before him. A woman, a Marine sergeant no older than 30, whose digital camouflage uniform was faded from the sun, and whose gear looked less like it belonged in a laboratory and more like it had been dragged through half the deserts on Earth. She said nothing. Her name was Eva Rostova, and her face remained a mask of placid neutrality. She didn't flinch, her gaze didn't waver, her posture didn't change. She simply stood, her hands resting lightly at her sides, a silent observer to her own public dismissal. Her silence was a vacuum, and Davies, a man who abhorred a vacuum, rushed to fill it with more words, each one a small, polished stone of condescension. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the rifle case at her feet. It was a battered pelican case, scuffed and scarred, with the stenciled words Rostova, ES barely visible under a layer of dust. I'm sure that peace has served you well in whatever sandbox you've been playing in, Sergeant. But we're testing the new Aegis L Mark IV targeting system today. It integrates with ship-based radar to provide real-time atmospheric data to the projectile's guidance system. The target is a 10-inch reactive plate at 2,500 meters. The system is designed to achieve a first-round hit in under 30 seconds from target acquisition. We are validating a $90 million software package. Your presence here, frankly, is a courtesy to the Marine Corps Liaison Office. Nothing more, he smiled, a thin, bloodless expression that didn't reach his eyes. So, please, feel free to observe. From a safe distance, the crowd chuckled again, more confidently this time. They were his people, Navy men and women, engineers from Lockheed and Raytheon. They understood the language of gigahertz and computational fluid dynamics. They saw the same thing Davies saw, an anachronism, a relic from an older, less sophisticated form of warfare. But high in the climate-controlled observation tower, a place of cool, quiet shadow above the shimmering heat of the range, a visiting four-star Marine general named Caldwell leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't looking at the commander's preening display. He wasn't listening to the technical jargon. He was watching the sergeant. He saw the way she stood, not at attention, but in a state of relaxed readiness, her weight perfectly balanced. He saw the way her eyes weren't focused on Davies, but were scanning the horizon, instinctively reading the subtle dance of the heat mirage, noting the direction the sparse desert grass was bending. He saw the worn leather of her boots and the faint, almost invisible scars on her knuckles. He saw a professional at rest. And when Sergeant Rostova finally knelt, not in deference, but to unlatch her rifle case, a flicker of profound, electric recognition crossed the old general's face, a memory of smoke and distance, and an impossible shot he had witnessed 20 years ago in a forgotten valley. He picked up a radio handset. His voice was a low gravel. Power to range control. Hold the test. Down on the firing line. Davies's smug expression faltered, replaced by confusion. He looked up toward the tower, but could only see his own reflection in the tinted glass. He didn't understand the pause. He didn't understand the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The laughter had died, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. The quiet sergeant was the only thing moving. The latches on her case opened with a series of deep, satisfying clicks, and as she lifted the lid, the weapon within seemed to drink the harsh desert light. It wasn't a standard issue rifle. It was an M210, a heavily modified M14, a weapon system that was more legend than hardware in most circles. It was old, but immaculately maintained. The walnut stock was dark with age and oil, worn smooth in the places where her hand and cheek had rested for thousands of hours. It was a tool, not a piece of technology. A part of her, not an accessory. The general's voice crackled over the range-wide speaker system, a voice that carried the weight of decades of command. Commander Davies, the sergeant will take the first shot. If you believe true competence needs no introduction, type silence below. The silence that followed the general's order was a physical thing. It pressed in on the ears of everyone present, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the faint hum of the electronics and the distant whisper of the wind. Commander Davies's face went through a rapid series of transformations. First, confusion, as his brain struggled to parse the illogical command. Second, indignation, as his authority was publicly and inexplicably usurped. Third, a flash of pure, unadulterated anger. He snatched the radio from his belt. "Tower, this is Range Commander Davies. Repeat your last. We are on a strict timetable to validate a critical weapons system for the fleet. We cannot." The general's voice cut him off, and this time it was not a suggestion. It was a blade. "Commander, you will stand down and you will give the sergeant whatever she requires. Is that understood?" The finality in that tone was absolute. Davies's jaw worked for a moment, but no sound came out. He slowly lowered the radio, his face a mottled red. The crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous, uncertain curiosity. They were now part of a drama they didn't understand, and the focus had shifted entirely to the quiet Marine who was now methodically laying out a worn canvas shooting mat. Sergeant Rostova seemed oblivious to the exchange. She moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. Every action was deliberate, practiced, and imbued with a deep, instinctual knowledge. She placed her rifle on its bipod, the metal legs clicking into place with a sound as crisp as breaking glass. She produced a small, leather-bound book from a pouch on her belt. A data book. To the engineers present, it was an absurdity, a relic from the age of sail. They had terabytes of atmospheric data being fed to their systems in real time. What could a pencil and paper possibly offer? Davies, recovering a sliver of his arrogance, decided to reassert himself through condescension. He strode over to her, his voice dripping with false concern. "Sergeant, I don't think you understand the complexity of the problem here. The distance is over 1.5 miles. The crosswind at the midway point is shearing at 12 knots, but there's an updraft from the canyon at 2,000 meters. The barometric pressure is dropping. Our system accounts for all of this. It even calculates for the Coriolis effect and spin drift. You can't possibly." He trailed off. She wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on the distant target, a tiny speck of silver shimmering in the heat haze. She had a kestrel wind meter in her hand, holding it up for a moment, but her eyes were on the world itself. She was reading the land, the way the heat distorted the shape of the rocks, the way a single dust devil spun lazily 1,000 yards out. She was taking in 1,000,000 points of data, processing them with a computer forged of instinct and a lifetime of experience. She opened her data book, licked the tip of a pencil, and made a few small notations. The sheer, analog simplicity of the act was an insult to the entire ethos of the high-tech facility. Davies felt a surge of frustration. "Sergeant, I am the range commander here, and I am telling you that this is a waste of time. You are delaying a vital naval exercise." Rostova finally turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray, and for the first time he saw the depth in them. There was no anger, no fear, no arrogance. There was only a profound, unshakable calm, a stillness that seemed to go on forever. She spoke, her voice quiet but clear and utterly devoid of emotion. "Yes, sir." "Understood." Then she turned away, her attention returning to her task. The dismissal was more profound than any shouted retort. She had acknowledged his rank, his position, and his words, and then she had simply set them aside as irrelevant data. She reached into an ammo pouch and produced a single cartridge. She held it in her palm for a moment. It was hand-loaded, the brass polished to a dull gleam. She rolled it between her thumb and forefinger, a final tactile check. Then, with a smooth, fluid motion, she slid the bolt of her rifle back, placed the round into the chamber, and closed the bolt with a solid, metallic thud. The sound, in the vast quiet of the desert, was as loud and final as a judge's gavel. She settled behind the rifle, her body seeming to merge with the earth. She was no longer a woman on a mat, but a part of the landscape, as natural and immovable as the rocks around her. Davies stood frozen, a statue of impotent rage, as the entire multi-million-dollar range held its breath for one Marine and her old, outdated rifle. The world narrowed to the circle of glass in her scope. For Sergeant Rostova, the noise, the people, the arrogant commander, and the weight of expectation all ceased to exist. There was only the process, a sacred ritual she had performed thousands of times in places far less forgiving than this. It began with breath, a slow, deliberate inhale, drawing the dry desert air deep into her lungs, feeling it expand, oxygenating her blood, calming her system. Then, the exhale, equally slow, releasing the tension from her muscles, letting her body settle deeper into the earth, her skeleton becoming the true support for the rifle. Her heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic drum, became the metronome for her actions. Thump, thump, pause. Thump, thump, pause. It was in that pause, the natural respiratory pause between heartbeats, that the world became still enough for a perfect shot. She was not aiming at a target. She was becoming one with a solution. Her mind was a whirlwind of silent calculation. The data from the Kestrel was a baseline, a starting point. The real information came from her eyes. The mirage, the shimmering waves of heat rising from the desert floor, was not a distraction. It was a tool. When it flowed straight up, the wind was calm. When it boiled, the wind was shifting. When it flowed left or right, it was a river of air she had to navigate. She watched it now, seeing it drift gently from right to left, a consistent 3-mile-per-hour wind. But that was here. Downrange, she saw the subtle sway of a lone creosote bush 1,000 meters out. It was moving differently, indicating a shift. Further still, the heat haze over the distant canyon shimmered with a vertical distortion, confirming the updraft Davies had so proudly mentioned. He had seen the data on a screen. She saw it written on the land itself. She laid her cheek against the worn walnut stock of the M210. The wood was cool and familiar, a constant companion. Her right hand curled around the pistol grip, her index finger resting lightly on the trigger guard, never touching the trigger itself until the moment was right. Her left hand was tucked under the butt of the stock, forming a stable rear bag, allowing for minute adjustments by squeezing or relaxing her fist. It was a living connection to her weapon. Her eye, pressed against the rubber eyepiece of the scope, saw the world in magnified detail. The 10-inch target plate, a tiny silver speck to the naked eye, was now a clear, defined circle. She wasn't aiming for the center. Her mind's eye saw the invisible forces that would act upon the bullet during its long flight. Gravity, a constant, predictable pull. Wind, a fickle, treacherous enemy. Spin drift, the tendency of the bullet to move in the direction of its spin. And the Coriolis effect, the subtle nudge of the Earth's rotation, a factor so small it was irrelevant to most shooters, but at this distance, it was the difference between a hit and a miss. She made the adjustments to her scope. The clicks of the elevation and windage knobs were the only sounds in her world, each one a precise, tactile confirmation of her calculations. Up 365 minutes of angle for elevation. Left 725 minutes for windage and drift. Her pencil and paper calculations, born from years of empirical data logged in her book, had given her the solution. She shifted her focus from the target itself to the crosshairs of her scope. The fine black lines were perfectly still, a fixed point in a shimmering, unstable world. The ritual of breath began again. Inhale, exhale halfway, and hold. The world stopped. Her finger moved from the guard to the trigger. She didn't pull it. She applied steady, increasing pressure, so smooth and so gradual that she herself would not know the exact moment the sear would break. It was a surprise. It had to be a surprise to prevent the tiny, involuntary flinch that could send a round feed off target at this range. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a firm, familiar push, not a violent kick. The muzzle flash was a brief, angry blossom of orange in the bright sunlight. The report of the shot, a sharp, supersonic crack, echoed across the desert, followed a moment later by the deeper boom of the muzzle blast. The entire sequence, from the final breath to the round leaving the barrel, took less than 2 seconds. But for the bullet, the journey had just begun. The 175-grain Sierra Match King bullet left the muzzle of the M210 traveling at just over 2,500 feet per second, spinning at a dizzying 120,000 revolutions per minute. It was a speck of sculpted lead and copper, an emissary of pure physics sent on a mission across a hostile and invisible landscape of air. For the first few hundred meters, its path was relatively flat and predictable. But as its velocity began to decay, the forces of nature began their relentless assault. The gentle crosswind nudged it to the left. The updraft from the canyon tried to lift it high. Gravity, the eternal constant, pulled it inexorably toward the earth. The bullet, stabilized by its rapid spin, fought against these forces, following the precise trajectory dictated by the calculations made by the woman behind the rifle. For the crowd on the firing line, the moment after the shot was one of profound anticlimax. The loud crack was gone, replaced once again by the desert silence. All eyes were strained toward the distant, invisible target. They were used to the instant feedback of their own systems, a flash of light, a digital confirmation on a screen. Now, there was only waiting. The bullet was still in flight, taking nearly 3.5 seconds to cross the 1.5-mile distance. 3.5 seconds of pure, unadulterated suspense. In the observation tower, General Caldwell watched through a high-powered spotting scope, his knuckles white on the tripod. Commander Davies stood on the line, a sneer already forming on his lips, ready to declare the inevitable miss and end this ridiculous farce. He was already composing the speech in his head, a dressing down of the sergeant, the Marine Corps, and this entire waste of his valuable time. And then it came. Not a loud bang, but a faint, metallic clang, a sound that traveled back across the desert on the wind, thin and lonely, but utterly unmistakable. It was the sound of lead striking steel. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Heads whipped toward the massive digital display board that was linked to the target's internal sensors. For a moment, it remained blank as the system processed the impact. Then, the numbers flashed to life, stark white against the black screen, and the silence of suspense was replaced by a new silence, one of pure, uncomprehending shock. Hit. Target center. Deviation from aim point. 0.75 millimeters. Velocity at impact. 1,052 FPS. Time to target. 342 seconds. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just stared at the screen, their minds refusing to accept what their eyes were telling them. 0.75 millimeters. A deviation smaller than the thickness of a credit card. It wasn't just a hit. It was a statistical impossibility. It was a shot that the $90 million Aegis L system, with all its computational power, would have been proud to make after a dozen calibration attempts. This woman, with her ancient rifle, her worn-out data book, and a single round, had done it on her first try. Davies stared, his mouth agape. The sneer had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief. The numbers on the screen were a direct, brutal refutation of his entire worldview. His expertise, his systems, his authority, all of it had been rendered meaningless by a single, perfectly placed piece of lead. He whispered the words to himself, a mantra of denial. No, no way. That's not possible. It's a fluke, a lucky shot, but he knew, and everyone on that line knew, that luck didn't exist at this range. There was no such thing as a lucky shot at 2,500 meters. There was only perfection, or there was failure. They had just witnessed perfection. Sergeant Rostova worked the bolt on her rifle, the empty brass casing ejecting with a flick of her wrist, spinning through the air in a graceful arc before landing softly in the dust. She didn't look at the screen. She didn't look at the stunned faces of the crowd. She already knew the result. She had known at the moment the trigger broke. The shot had felt right. She calmly began to pack her gear, her movements just as methodical and unhurried as before, as if she had done nothing more remarkable than finish a routine task. The deafening silence on the range stretched on, a testament to an act of competence so profound it had left no room for words. From the cool, shaded interior of the observation tower, General Caldwell descended, his boots echoing on the steel staircase. The crowd on the firing line parted for him instinctively, a sea of white and khaki uniforms creating a path. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't even glance at the pale, stunned face of Commander Davies. His eyes were fixed on the lone figure of Sergeant Rostova, who was now carefully wiping down her rifle with an oiled cloth before placing it back in its case. He walked with a purpose that was both deliberate and immensely heavy, the walk of a man who had seen entire chapters of history written in violence and discipline. The air crackled with the unasked question, who was this woman? How was this possible? The general came to a stop a few feet from her. She looked up, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever, and gave a simple, professional nod. General, he didn't return the nod. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the faded uniform, the quiet confidence, the absolute lack of ego. He saw not just a sergeant, but the living embodiment of an ethos he had dedicated his life to. He turned his head slightly, his voice directed at his aide, a young captain who had followed him down from the tower. The general's voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent range with the weight of absolute authority. Captain, pull up the service record for Sergeant Eva Rostova. Marine Corps serial number 8541212. Display it on the main screen. All of it. Unclassified summary first. The captain, looking bewildered, fumbled with a ruggedized tablet. Sir, all of it? You heard me, son, the general said, his eyes never leaving Rostova. Everything that isn't compartmented. On a massive display board, the impossible numbers from the target sensor vanished, replaced by the stark, functional text of a military personnel file. A photo appeared. Rostova, younger, her face hard and serious in her boot camp graduation photo. And then, the data began to scroll. It was a litany of achievement, a biography written in acronyms and commendations, each line more unbelievable than the last. The aide, his voice trembling slightly as he read from his tablet, began to narrate the file aloud, his words broadcast over the range speakers for all to hear. Rostova, Eva S., Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Primary military occupational specialty, 0317, Scout Sniper. A murmur went through the crowd. Scout Sniper. The words themselves were legendary, synonymous with a level of skill and hardship that was almost mythic. But that was just the beginning. Graduate, Marine Corps Recruit, Depot, Paris Island, Honor Graduate. Graduate, School of Infantry, Honor Graduate. Graduate, Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, Quantico, Virginia. The aide paused, his eyes widening. Sir, it says here she was the Corps' honor graduate and recipient of the Carlos Hathcock Award for High Shooter. The name Carlos Hathcock hung in the air, a name spoken with reverence in the world of marksmanship. To win an award bearing his name was like a physicist winning an award named after Einstein. The file continued to scroll. Specialized training, high-angle marksmanship course, urban sniper course, special operations target interdiction course, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school. Each course represented months, sometimes years, of punishing physical and mental conditioning. To complete one was a mark of distinction. To have completed them all was unheard of. The general let the weight of that information settle in before he spoke again. Continue, Captain. Combat de promo. The aide swallowed hard, his voice now filled with a sense of awe that bordered on fear. He was no longer just reading a file. He was unveiling a ghost. Combat deployments, 7. Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, 3 tours. Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2 tours. Operation Inherent Resolve, Syria/Iraq, 2 tours. The sheer density of combat experience was staggering. These weren't peacekeeping missions. These were the hardest, most brutal conflicts of the modern era. Each tour represented a lifetime of experience packed into a handful of months, a crucible that forged soldiers into something more or broke them completely. Rostova had not been broken. The file scrolled to her unit assignments, and another wave of shock rippled through the assembled personnel. Unit assignments: 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command, MARSOC. The Marine Corps' elite Special Operations Force, the tip of the spear. The sailors and contractors exchanged wide-eyed glances. This woman wasn't just some grunt who got lucky with a rifle. She was a Tier 1 operator, a member of the most exclusive and deadly brotherhood in the armed forces. And then came the awards and decorations. The aide's voice was barely a whisper now. Awards: Silver Star, the 3rd highest award for valor in combat. Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor, 2 oak leaf clusters, meaning she had been awarded it 3 separate times for 3 separate acts of heroism. Purple Heart, 2 oak leaf clusters, wounded in action on 3 separate occasions. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with V device. Combat Action Ribbon, Presidential Unit Citation. The list went on and on, a cascade of color and prestige that painted a portrait of a warrior who had walked through fire and emerged unscathed, a quiet professional who had done extraordinary things in the forgotten corners of the world, far from the polished floors of facilities like this. The file finally came to a stop. A long, heavy silence descended once more. Everyone looked from the screen to the rifle to the woman. They were finally beginning to understand. They were not in the presence of a sergeant. They were in the presence of a legend. General Caldwell took a slow step forward. He looked directly at Commander Davies, and for the first time, his expression was one of cold, undisguised fury. "Commander," he said, his voice like grinding stone, "assumptions are the mother of all failures. You assumed rank and service branch were a measure of competence. You assumed technology was a substitute for skill. You assumed you knew what a warrior looked like. You were wrong, on all counts." He then turned his back on the humiliated commander, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He faced Sergeant Rostova. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. In a motion as sharp and precise as the crack of a rifle, he brought his hand up in a perfect, formal salute. It was not the casual salute an officer gives a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound, unambiguous respect, a public acknowledgement from a 4-star general to a sergeant, an act that shattered every protocol of military hierarchy. "Sergeant Rostova," General Caldwell said, his voice ringing with authority and reverence. "Your demonstration today was a masterclass. Thank you for reminding my colleagues what a United States Marine is capable of. It is an honor to be on the same range as you." Rostova simply returned the salute, her own gesture equally crisp and professional. "Thank you, sir." Her work was done. Her point had been made, not with words, but with a single, undeniable act of excellence. The validation was complete. The story of Sergeant Rostova's shot spread through the White Sands facility like a shockwave. It didn't travel through official channels or after-action reports. It moved the way all true legends do, through whispers, through gossip, through the incredulous retelling of the event by those who had witnessed it. The range technicians who had seen the raw sensor data spoke in hushed tones about the ghost round, a shot so perfect it seemed to defy the laws of physics. They printed out the data sheet, a simple piece of paper with the impossible numbers on it, and pinned it to the corkboard in their workshop, right next to schematics for billion-dollar radar systems. The Navy pilots at the Officers Club that evening overheard the story from a young ensign who had been on the line. At first, they were skeptical, dismissing it as rangeline hyperbole. But as more and more witnesses confirmed the details, the old rifle, the arrogant commander, the public call-out from a four-star general, and the single, perfect shot, their skepticism turned to awe. The story became a parable, a lesson passed from the grizzled senior NCOs to the fresh-faced junior officers. It was a story about the danger of assumptions, about the quiet, deadly competence that often hides behind a humble exterior. The name Rostova became a new piece of local vernacular. A difficult task was a Rostova problem. A perfect solution was pulling a Rostova, the firing point she had used, previously designated only by a sterile number, was unofficially christened Morgan's Line, a quiet nod to her legendary call sign. A name only a few MARSOC operators would understand, but one that General Caldwell had made sure was known. Commander Davies endured the most transformative humiliation of his career. General Caldwell's public rebuke was followed by a private one that was, by all accounts, far more brutal. He was not formally relieved of command, but his authority was irrevocably shattered. He was a ghost in his own facility, the subject of whispers and sideways glances wherever he went. The incident forced upon him a painful and necessary period of introspection. He spent hours in his office rewatching the telemetry footage of Rostova's shot, the video of her calm, methodical preparation playing on a loop. He saw not an inferior, but a master of a craft he had foolishly believed he understood. The arrogance was burned out of him, cauterized by the white-hot shame of his public failure. He began to change. He started listening during briefings instead of just talking. He would walk the facility, asking questions of the junior sailors and technicians, seeking their input, valuing their hands-on experience over the theoretical knowledge of his officers. He requested a formal transfer for a new billet, one where he could start over, but before he left, he did one last thing. He found Sergeant Rostova in a quiet maintenance bay, where she was meticulously disassembling the bolt of her M210, cleaning each component with a focus that was almost meditative. He stood before her, no longer the preening, self-important commander, but a humble, diminished man. "Sergeant," he began, his voice quiet and strained. I want to apologize. My conduct was unprofessional and inexcusable. I was wrong. What you did out there, it was the single most impressive display of skill I have ever witnessed. I will carry the lesson you taught me for the rest of my career." Rostova paused her work, looking up at him. She saw the genuine contrition in his eyes. She simply nodded. Apology accepted. "Commander," she offered no platitudes, no words of comfort. She simply accepted his apology and returned to her work. For her, the incident was already in the past. It was just another day, another task completed to the highest possible standard. The ego, the drama, the apology, all of it was just noise. The only thing that mattered was the silent, disciplined pursuit of perfection. The legacy of that day was solidified not by the whispers, but by a single, symbolic artifact. On General Caldwell's direct order, the range technicians scoured the dust until they found the spent brass casing from Rostova's single shot. It was cleaned and polished, but the small scratches and dents from its ejection were left untouched, a testament to its authenticity. A master machinist from the Naval Yard was commissioned to build a small, elegant display stand of teak and brushed steel. The casing was mounted vertically, a small brass monument to a perfect moment. Beneath it, a simple plaque was engraved. It didn't mention her name or rank at her specific request. It read, "The Standard, 2,500 meters. One round. This is what right looks like." The display was placed in the main lobby of the White Sands Command Building, a place every officer, contractor, and visiting dignitary would have to pass. It became a silent teacher, a constant, gleaming reminder that the most advanced technology is only as good as the human being operating it, and that true expertise is not proclaimed with words, but proven with deeds. Commander Davies, in his final days at the facility, would often be seen standing before the display, staring at the small piece of brass, a man contemplating the brutal lesson it had taught him. He eventually transferred to a staff job at the Pentagon, and those who served with him later described him as one of the most humble and effective officers they had ever known, a man who measured everyone by their competence, not the insignia on their collar. Sergeant Rostova, meanwhile, remained a study in quiet professionalism. She deflected all praise with a quiet, "I was just doing my job, sir." She had no interest in the legend that was growing around her. Her focus was, as always, on the mission. A few days after the incident, a group of young Navy SEAL candidates at the facility for cross-training sought her out. They found her on a small, dusty range, patiently coaching a young Marine corporal on the fundamentals of marksmanship. One of the SEALs, a brash young officer full of the confidence that came with his elite status, asked her for the secret to her shot. He expected a complex answer about ballistics or secret breathing techniques. Rostova paused her instruction and looked at him. "There's no secret," she said, her voice calm and even. "You master the fundamentals. You do them the same way, every single time, until you can't get them wrong. You respect the process. The rest is just noise." She then turned back to the young corporal, giving him her full attention, leaving the SEALs to ponder the simple, profound truth of her words. She was not a hero who had risen to an occasion. She was a professional whose relentless, daily pursuit of excellence had made the impossible seem routine. Her philosophy was her legacy: quiet competence, relentless discipline, and a profound understanding that the shot is made long before the trigger is ever pulled. It is made in the thousands of hours of unseen, unglamorous, and silent practice. A year passed. The seasons changed in the high desert, but the small brass casing in the lobby of the command building remained, its luster undimmed. The story of the shot had become institutional folklore, a foundational myth told to every new sailor, Marine, and civilian who was assigned to the White Sands facility. It was no longer a story about a single event, but a parable about the culture of the institution itself. The Rostova standard was now an official part of the command's philosophy, a shorthand for a new way of thinking that valued proven skill over assumed authority and inter-service collaboration over tribal prejudice. The arrogant, competitive edge between the Navy and Marine detachments had softened, replaced by a mutual respect born from a shared memory of profound awe. New training protocols, directly inspired by Rostova's methodical, data-driven, but instinct-honed approach, had been implemented across the board, leading to a measurable increase in first-round hit probabilities for all of the facility's advanced systems. The machines had learned a lesson from the human. Commander Davies' replacement, a sharp, insightful Navy captain, made it a point to begin her first all-hands briefing by telling the story of the shot, using her predecessor's failure as a crucial lesson in leadership and humility. The legend had become a tool for teaching, a way to shape a better, more effective generation of warriors and technicians. And what of Sergeant Rostova? She was long gone. Her temporary assignment had ended, and she had vanished back into the classified world of special operations from which she had briefly emerged. There were no statues in her honor, no buildings named after her. Her official file remained a collection of dry facts and redacted mission reports. Her legacy was not written in stone or brass, but in the changed attitudes of the men and women she had left behind. Her legacy was in the young Navy lieutenant who now kept a meticulous paper data book alongside his digital tablet. It was in the senior engineer who now spent more time talking to the junior technicians on the range, valuing their observations of the real world over the clean data of the lab. It was in the quiet, earned respect that now defined the professional culture of the entire base. Her impact was not an explosion, but a resonance, a vibration that continued to echo long after she was gone, subtly and permanently altering the shape of everything it touched. True greatness does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives in a faded uniform, speaks in a quiet voice, and leaves behind nothing but a perfect, undeniable result and a standard that others will spend their entire careers striving to meet. Her silence had been her argument. Her competence had been her verdict. The sun set over the distant mountains, painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple. In the lobby of the command building, the last rays of light caught the polished brass of the single-shell casing, making it glow with a soft, warm light. A janitor, making his nightly rounds, paused to wipe a speck of dust from the glass case, his movements gentle and reverent. He had been there that day. He had heard the crack of the rifle and the stunned silence that followed. He knew the story was true. The casing was not just a symbol of a single, perfect shot. It was a monument to a deeper truth, that character is not revealed in the noise of self-promotion, but in the quiet of disciplined action. It represented the idea that respect is a currency that cannot be demanded or inherited. It can only be earned, often in the moments when no one is expecting you to succeed. The legacy of a true professional is not the story they tell about themselves, but the stories others tell about them long after they are gone. It is the standard they set, the example they become, a silent testament to a competence so profound it needed no words to announce itself. True legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's the standard that continues forward in your absence, a silent testament to a competence so profound it needed no words. That single round, fired from an old rifle by a quiet Marine, had done more to shape the future of that facility than $1 billion worth of technology. It had reminded an entire generation of warriors and scientists that the human element, the disciplined mind, the steady hand, the humble heart, is and always will be the most advanced weapon system of all. It proved that in the final calculus of conflict and competition, the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most dangerous. The most dangerous is the one you never hear coming, the one who has mastered the art of silence, precision, and professionalism. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.